reference points to begin this review. On the surface of the cerebrum, we see the lateral sulcus, which separates the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe. The central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The frontal lobe is dedicated to motor functions, conception of motor actions, planning motor actions, and weighing consequences of those actions. The precentral gyrus is the ridge in front of the central sulcus. This region contains the upper motor neuron cell bodies. The axons projecting from these cell bodies will travel through the internal capsule, decussate in the medulla, and become the corticospinal tract. These neurons are arranged in a somatotopic map we will be reviewing shortly. The premotor area, shown here, is divided into the lateral premotor area and the supplementary motor area. The purpose of this region is to plan multi-joint actions and consider the consequences of those actions. The region anterior to the premotor area is where we think about and plan what we wish to do. The premotor area weighs consequences of those actions, and the upper motor neurons of the precentral gyrus execute those actions. Posterior to the central sulcus is the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is also called the somatosensory cortex. It is concerned with processing and integrating sensory input from the body. The ridge posterior to the central sulcus, the postcentral gyrus, contains a somatotopic map of the body. Neurons in this area correspond to specific regions on the body. For example, if you touch someone on the right elbow, a neuron in the left postcentral gyrus corresponding to the right elbow activates. We will be reviewing this map in the coming slides. The secondary sensory area is responsible for determining what kind of sensation the patient is feeling. You can touch the patient's right elbow and the left primary sensory area activates. The secondary sensory area activates to determine if you touched the patient with a pin or a cotton wisp. The tertiary sensory area assigns an emotional value to the different stimuli. A good example of this is sharp needles. Some people become queasy at the thought of being touched by a needle. Other people have multiple piercings and tattoos. The needle is the same. It is the interpretation of the stimulus which differs. As we continue the tour around the outside of the cerebrum, we next land at the occipital lobe, where visual stimuli are processed. The specific division between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe is seen on the medial surface. The temporal lobe is responsible for processing sound and smell, and the medial temporal lobe is crucial for the development of memory. The medial temporal lobe contains the amygdala, a main component of the limbic system responsible for moods and emotions. In the left frontal lobe, the motor portion of the brain, is a region called Broca's area. Broca's area is responsible for the motor component of language expression. This area is located on the surface of the frontal lobe, adjacent to the neurons which activate the hand and the mouth. At the left parieto-temporal occipital junction is a region called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is responsible for language understanding. The temporal lobe is responsible for hearing. As you listen to this recording, the sounds are forwarded to Wernicke's area to be interpreted as having meaning. As you see the words that appear on the slide, the information from the occipital lobe is forwarded to Wernicke's area for interpretation. Blind people learn to read Braille, which is running a finger over raised bumps on the page. You've all run your fingers over the Braille instructions at the ATM. The sensation from the bumps are sent to the parietal lobe. That information is forwarded to Wernicke's area for interpretation. Wernicke's area is at the junction of the three sensory lobes. Due to its location, we are able to experience language from each of those lobes. On the medial surface of the brain, we see that the central sulcus wraps around to the medial surface. On the medial brain, we still have the separation of motor from sensory. We also see the parieto-occipital fissure, which separates those two lobes. Also prominent is the corpus callosum, which is a bundle of axons connecting the right hemisphere of the cerebrum to the left hemisphere of the cerebrum. On top of the corpus callosum is the cingulate gyrus, which runs through the frontal, parietal, and into the occipital lobes. The cingulate gyrus is a major component of the limbic system. We also note on this view that the primary motor strip, the upper motor neurons, and primary sensory strip extend to the medial surface of the brain. Here we see that the limbic system incorporates the medial and inferior parts of the lobes of the brain. As a general rule in neurologic development, the more medial a structure is, and the more inferior a structure is, the more primitive the structure is. The limbic system assigns positive and negative emotions to every experience. On the medial surface of the frontal lobe, we see the medial frontal micturition center and a bowel control center. These centers are responsible for voluntary control of bowel and bladder function. In a later lecture, we will discuss what lesions in this area specifically do to bowel and bladder function. This is a coronal section of the brain. We see several prominent structures deep within the brain here. In the next slides, we will be labeling these structures and discussing their function. The internal capsule is a bundle of axons projecting from the thalamus up to the gray matter on the surface of the cerebrum. Additionally, the axons projecting from the gray matter on the surface of the cerebrum and proceeding to the spinal cord go through here. The thalamus is the gateway to the cerebrum. Nearly all sensory inputs go from the receptor to the thalamus and then to the cerebrum. Only scent does not. The thalamus also sets the activity level of the cerebrum. More thalamic activation means more cerebral activity. Less thalamic activation means less cerebral activity. The caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, the subthalamic nucleus, and the substantia nigra make up the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia act to activate or inhibit the thalamus. The output from the basal ganglia essentially acts as a dimmer switch for thalamic and therefore cortical activity. On this slide, we've just colored in all of the components of the basal ganglia in the same color. The amygdala of the temporal lobe is an emotion center. It lies near where olfaction is processed. It also lies near auditory processing centers. It lies near the hypothalamus, which regulates the autonomic system and the endocrine system. The amygdala plays a role in assigning emotional context to sound and smell and plays a role in memory development. Heschel's gyrus, located on the superior medial temporal lobe, contains the primary, secondary, and tertiary areas for hearing and interpretation. The red nucleus of the midbrain is the relay nucleus for the cerebellum. The cerebellum acts on the upper motor neurons. The relay pathway from the deep cerebellar nuclei runs to the red nucleus, to the thalamus, and then to the cerebral cortex. Here we see the motor map of the precentral gyrus. By understanding this map, we can put together a patient's signs and symptoms to find the area of lesion. For example, if a patient has high blood pressure, low heart rate, and irregular respiration, as tested in visceral diagnosis, combined with weakness of the right arm, we can say that the patient has a possible brain tumor of the left lateral frontal lobe. The increased blood pressure with decreased heart rate, combined with irregular respiration, indicates intracranial mass. The weakness suggests frontal lobe involvement. Weakness of the right arm points to the left lateral frontal lobe. Here is the sensory map of the postcentral gyrus. On the motor side, the more surface area devoted to a body part indicates the more motor actions that body part does. Likewise, the more surface area devoted on the sensory side, the more sensitive that body part. On the spinal cord cross-section, we will draw in the anterior spinal artery and the two posterior spinal arteries. Here we see the vascular distributions of the anterior and posterior spinal arteries. In the next slides, we will be looking at the main tracts of the spinal cord. Tracts in the red area will be affected if the patient has a large midline disc bulge or spinal stenosis. On this slide, we will draw a line separating the anterior and posterior halves of the spinal cord. The rule is that tracts on the posterior are sensory, tracts in the front are motor. The exceptions to this rule help us to remember where the decussations occur. If a sensory tract is in the motor half of the spinal cord, the tract will decussate in the spinal cord. If a motor tract is in the sensory half of the spinal cord, it decussates in the brainstem. This brings us to the first of the three tracts you need to know for this class, CLET, and really the rest of your life. Just three tracts. The dorsal columns, the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus, transmit light touch, vibration, and conscious proprioception to the nucleus cuneatus and the nucleus gracilis of the medulla. The fasciculus gracilis transmits light touch, vibration, and conscious proprioception from the lower extremity. Remember, there's a gracilis muscle in the leg. Of special note is that these neurons connect to receptors in the extremities. The nerve runs to the cell body of the dorsal root ganglia. The axon projects into the spinal cord and becomes the dorsal column tract. In other words, if you tickle your big toe with a cotton swab, the same nerve runs all the way from your toe to your medulla. The spinothalamic tract transmits pain, temperature, and crude touch. Since the tract is in the front of the spinal cord, it decussates immediately in the spinal cord. Therefore, a lesion of the left spinothalamic tract will result in loss of pain, temperature, and crude touch on the right side of the body. The third tract we need to know is the lateral corticospinal tract. This tract carries conscious motor signals from the brain to the spinal cord. This tract is made of the axons projecting from the precentral gyrus. The decussation for this tract is in the pyramids of the medulla. Sometimes this tract is called the pyramidal tract. The reticulospinal tract is unconscious and therefore not easily testable during the neurologic exam. With the previous three tracts, we can test them easily by poking the patient with a sharp toothpick, tickling the patient with a cotton wisp, or asking the patient to raise the arm. The reticulospinal tract carries unconscious motor signals for postural stabilization, autonomic control, and pain modulation. We will see which portions of the reticular formation contribute to which functions in the next few slides. The vestibulospinal tract is a motor tract from the vestibular nucleus to the lower extremities. This comes into play when you slip on a banana peel. Your ankle slips out from under you, and the proprioception must travel from your ankle to your pons and cerebrum, and then travel back to your ankle to contract muscles to keep you from falling. The nerve conduction required is approximately twice your height. Imagine being a very tall basketball player. But if your head jerks when you slip, the vestibular system activates and there is a descending motor signal generated right to the legs. This is one-way transmission, half the overall distance. Instead of foot to brainstem to foot, this is just brainstem to foot transmission. Here we see the brainstem from the side. The top is the midbrain, the middle, the beer belly part, is the pons, and the inferior is the medulla. and the posterior part is the cerebellum. The three lobes of the cerebellum are shown here: the anterior lobe, the posterior lobe, and the flocculonodular lobe. The reticular formation is a network of nuclei spread throughout the brainstem. These nuclei influence the cranial nerve nuclei and project upward to the thalamus and downward to the spinal cord. The reticular formation of the midbrain projects upward to activate the thalamus, for example, waking you up in the morning, and projects downward into the spinal cord to inhibit pain sensation in the body. The pontine reticular formation projects to the spinal cord for postural stabilization. The medullary reticular formation projects downward to influence the IML, the autonomic neurons of the spinal cord, as well as the autonomic nuclei in the medulla. Here we see the cranial nerves as they arise from the brainstem. Cranial nerves 3 and 4 arise from the midbrain. Cranial nerves 5, 6, and 7 arise from the pons. Cranial nerves 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 arise from the medulla. Of particular note here is that at the pontomedullary junction, cranial nerves 5, 6, 7, and 8 all arise from the same location. A lesion at this location can affect all four of these cranial nerves at the same time. This diagram shows the coronal view of the brain, the spinal cord cross-section, and the effector muscle. We see here that the upper motor neuron has its cell body on the surface of the right frontal lobe. The axon travels down through the internal capsule, decussates in the medulla, and travels down the corticospinal tract on the left. When we talk about muscular weakness in this class, don't think of lifting 20 pounds instead of 60 pounds. Consider weakness as loss or decrease in voluntary control of the muscle. In this case, an upper motor neuron lesion, a stroke, a tumor, or spinal cord compression will result in weakness because it affects the integrity of the pathway for voluntary control. Additionally, upper motor neurons are primarily inhibitory, so when they stop inhibiting, muscle tone increases and tendon reflexes get more exaggerated. You may be familiar with the Babinski response. If not, we'll get to it later this quarter. The response is normal in infants, but absent in adults. The reason is that during development, we develop the ability to inhibit this response. If we lose the ability to inhibit the Babinski response, it returns and is considered a pathological reflex. Here we see the lower motor neuron originating in the anterior horn of the spinal cord and traveling along the nerve root and peripheral nerve to activate the muscle. When there is a lower motor neuron lesion, there will also be weakness because the muscle is not getting proper neurological innervation. But in this case, muscle tone and tendon reflexes decrease. The nerve that causes the muscle to partially contract, giving it muscle tone, and causing the muscle to respond to stretch is lesioned by compression, traction, injury, subluxation. The disconnection can be so severe in cases of total nerve injury that the muscle will atrophy, die, and be replaced by scar tissue. Our final discussion today will be the components of a reflex. Pictured here is a spinal cord cross-section for a deep tendon reflex or withdrawal reflex. The components we will be discussing are present in brainstem reflexes as well as spinal cord reflexes. A reflex is a response to a given stimulus. All reflexes have a sensory component. In the case of a tendon reflex, when the tendon is stretched, the muscle spindle registers the stretch. In the case of pupillary reflexes, the retina reacts to light being shined in the eye. Each reflex also has a motor nerve, the nerve which causes a muscle to contract, the pupil to constrict, the heart rate to slow, or the eye to blink. The integration center is where the synapses occur. In the case of a deep tendon reflex, the synapse occurs in the spinal cord. In the case of pupillary light responses, the synapses occur in the midbrain. In blink responses, the synapses occur in the pons. But what is shown in black is all the other things that may be occurring. For example, if you shine a light in the right eye, the right pupil constricts, but the left pupil also constricts because the sensory input crosses the midline to activate the other side as well. If you step on a tack with your right foot, the withdrawal reflexes causes you to flex your right knee and hip. The left knee and hip go into extension, called the crossed extensor reflex. The main point here is that we realize the three components of the reflex.